Kathleen.
Okay, great. Thank you. So attendees are coming in. We're going to give everybody else a few moments to join us and make sure that everybody has made it in from the parking lot. Thank you for your patience. We were dealing with some technical difficulties. And I was suddenly wondering why I was hearing my voice back to myself in my ears. That was the YouTube live stream, which has started as well. So welcome to the folks who are watching via the YouTube live stream. I am going to hand it over to Lorena Gauthereau, who is going to introduce our speakers today and get this keynote started.
Give me 1 second to pull up these slides. Okay. All right, welcome to our keynote presentation. I'm going to briefly introduce our keynotes. I want to give them as much time as possible to give their presentations, and then they're going to talk amongst themselves. Tanya and I will be moderating, and then after the conversation, we will look at the chat for any questions from the audience. Today we have ASL translators, Eduardo Reveles and Alison Smithera, as well as captionist Leah Helm. And so if you would like to look at the ASL translators, please make sure you're pulling up their videos on your screen. Dr. Maria Eugenia Cotera is Associate Professor in the Mexican American and Latino Studies Department at the University of Texas at Austin. She has curated several public history exhibits, including Las Rebeldes, Stories of Strength and Struggle in Southeast Michigan, and Chicana Fotos, Nancy de los Santos. She currently serves as an advisor and consultant on numerous large-scale digital public humanities projects, focusing on the Latinx experience. Her edited volume with Dion Espinosa and Maylee Blackwell, Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Feminism and Activism in the Movement Era, has been adopted in courses across the country. She is also the co-director of Chicana por mi Raza Digital Collective Memory. Dr. Andrea Roberts is Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and Associate Director of the Center for Housing and Urban Development at Texas A&M University. Her 15 years experience in public administration and community development inform her efforts to move disappearing Black communities from the margin to the center of public discourse through applied research that shapes policy and practice. She is the founder of the Texas Freedoms Colonies Project, a research and social justice initiative that leverages its atlas to make visible Black placemaking heritage and disparate ecological and development impacts on Black communities. She is currently writing a book about Black historic preservation practice. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Cotera share her screen. Take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I just want to say that it's a huge honor to be speaking to this body of scholars and to be sharing space, especially with Dr. Roberts, who is doing such incredible work in terms of tying the digital to embodied memory and cultural landscape. I also want to thank Dr. J. Lynn de Maria from UNM, University of New Mexico, who's allowed me to use her stunning photographs in this presentation. So the Chicana por mi Raza Digital Memory Project, which I'm going to be talking about today, is focused on a somewhat more dispersed collective geography of memory than the one that Dr. Roberts has been exploring. But I think there's some really interesting resonances between the two projects, and I hope to illuminate those in what follows. So Chicana por mi Raza is a post-custodial, sorry, I'm going to minimize my side thing. Okay. Chicana por mi Raza is a post-custodial digital archive that documents the hidden history of Chicana feminist activism and organizing in the movement years. The project was launched in 2009 in collaboration with Linda Garcia Merchant, and Marco Seiferli Valencia, our digital archivist, joined the project in 2013. Like most archival recovery projects, CPMR emerged in response to a profound absence. Sorry. Oh, okay, here we go. So in our historical memory, as daughters of avowed Chicana feminists who published and organized through the 1970s and 1980s, and here are both of our mothers are pictured in these images, we knew that there was a massive untapped reservoir of memory, both embodied and documentary, that was not being collected by institutional archives. As a consequence of this archival absence, scholars continued to leave Chicanas out of the history books and historiographic accounts of the movement years, which made it even less likely that their materials would be collected by major institutions. So we set out to interrupt this negative feedback loop by collecting oral histories and digitizing the personal archives of Chicanas in the Southwest and the Midwest. Over the last decade, we've traveled with students, scanners, video equipment to the homes of women who were active in the movement years and conducted oral histories with them, digitizing as many archival documents as possible in the few days that we're with them. Students have been central to the project. They scan and process digitized documents and video, they catalog and apply metadata and upload materials to Clouder, which is our login protected content management system. They also create curations for our public website, including biographies, historical essays, and visualizations. Since 2009, we have recorded hundreds of oral histories, amassed the largest digital collection of Chicana archives in the world with over 10,000 digital assets, launched partner projects in Wisconsin, Chicago, Houston, Minnesota, and New Mexico, and curated 2 public exhibits and developed a number of resources for teachers. We've done this work without the assistance of any major library or national grant, relying on a combination of my faculty research funds, small grants from various universities, server space at a series of institutions, and of course, plentiful student labor. CPMR's existence at the margins of the digital humanities reveals the continued precarity of Chicana memory, which I would argue is pretty much the constant state of marginalized archives everywhere, both digital and analog. Our precarity has forced us to think about the archive in generative ways, to ask different questions of it, interrogate what it is, where it is, and who it is. It has also pushed us to consider what it means to do digital humanities beyond the university and its related institutions. In and through this labor in the margins, we've developed a Chicanx digital memory praxis centered on the idea of memory keeping. Memory keeping is grounded in the many acts of remembering and information sharing that constitute, as Cindy Fierros and Dolores Delgado Bernal have argued, a Chicana epistemology. It frames our practice of digital recuperation as a collective endeavor in which multiple collaborators have a shared responsibility for preserving and activating Chicana memory. Memory keeping foregrounds relationships over digital tools, self-determination and autonomy over institutional visibility, and capacity building over the development of expertise amongst a select few. Engaging a Rasquachi digital practice that creatively reuses existing infrastructures of power to achieve these aims, it decenters the university as a site of knowledge power and builds community knowledge hubs and distributed knowledge networks. Activated in and through our practices of oral history, archival collection, digitization, and historical interpretation, our digital memory praxis approaches the archive as both a site for the preservation of historical memory and a set of living relationships, which don't end once the quote unquote collection of data is done. Rather than a static repository waiting to be mined by properly credentialed scholars, we have conceived of the digital archive as an active space of encounter or encuentro, and a memory keeping technology that allows us to build collectivities even as we build collections. In keeping with these aims, we've turned to strategic partnerships with collaborators in regions that are rich in Chicana history, but don't have access to the critical infrastructure necessary to support large-scale digital humanities projects. These partnerships allow us to share the technical knowledge and tools we've developed over the last decade, while adding important documents and oral histories to our digital collection, expanding its geographic scope and growing the Chicana archive. Our partners also broadened the CPMR collective, bringing new researchers, community members, and students into the fold. In our most recent partnership, a digital archiving field school in northern New Mexico that we taught in June, which was first conceptualized actually 3 years ago in 2018, when we went to visit Enriqueta Vasquez in northern New Mexico. We went there to interview her because she was a central figure in the Chicano movement in New Mexico and beyond. She was actually known for her regular column in El Grito, which is recognized widely as one of the most important newspapers of the period, and it was edited by Betita Martinez, who unfortunately just passed. Enriqueta was also an important feminist voice in the struggle for land, indigenous rights, and preservation of cultural heritage. Moreover, her home and surrounding lands, its adobe buildings, Camposanto, which means cemetery, and communal spaces hold the traces of important social justice networks that stretch between Colorado and northern New Mexico. And yet when we visited Vasquez in 2018, we were shocked to discover that her archive had still not been collected by a major institution. So following that trip, we developed the Enriqueta Vasquez Digital History Project in partnership with Dr. Tessa Cordova, who is an adjunct faculty at the University of New Mexico and the founder of Las Pistoleras, a local collective of Chicana and indigenous women based in El Prado, New Mexico, which is just north of Taos. Together, we designed a 2-week regionally focused field school at Las Pistoleras in which students would digitize the remainder of Enriqueta Vasquez's archive that we did not finish digitizing for CPMR and prepare the materials to be acquired by an institutional collection. Funded through a grant in aid from the U.S. Latinx Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Houston, the University of New Mexico, and other institutional partners, the field school drew heavily on Tessa's wide-ranging network of scholars and community experts who were part of the Las Pistoleras collective. We aim to provide students enrolled in the course with an immersive, hands-on research experience in northern New Mexico that would ground their digital work in the specificities of place. To know a place, we must interview the landscape. Dr. Jaylin de Maria said this on the first morning of the first day of our field school, as she shared her approach to documentary media with students and community members. This phrase really stuck with me. I knew how to interview people, but what exactly did it mean to interview a landscape? The answer revealed itself over the duration of our field experience, expanding the terrain of archival encuentro as I had imagined it, beyond the intimate space of the home where most of our work usually unfolds, and illuminating the importance of centering memory keeping in our digital praxis. Interviewing a landscape means first and foremost grounding ourselves in a time space of place, slowing down, if not abandoning our agreed upon schedule, adjusting it to honor conscious and embodied exploration of space and its meanings. It requires paying close attention to the ways in which space is shaped by social practices that map different meanings onto the landscape. On the first day of the field school, Tessa organized a tour of 2 burial grounds, the Kit Carson Cemetery in Taos, where the city's white founding fathers are memorialized, and a somewhat more humble Camposanto adjacent to Enriqueta's home in San Cristobal, where many Chicano movement activists are buried. Reading regional space through the landscapes of these distinct sites of memorialization, students began to understand why and how space matters, and why the Camposanto adjacent to Enriqueta's home is a critical part of her story. Interviewing the landscape also means taking time for everyday acts of remembrance, interrupting the flow of learning to pause with nature and gain a different, more intimate knowledge of space and place. It means learning about struggles over space, resources, and autonomy from women like Pistolera Petra Quintana, who taught us about the importance of traditional water systems, or acequias, to both Pueblo and Mexicano communities. Pablo Martinez told us the story of community efforts to stop dangerous mining in Cuesta, New Mexico. And Dave Real offered the story of a different history of the region through vivid storytelling centered on actual events and individuals in the community, a history from the bottom up. Even our lunch breaks were occasions to reflect on what it meant to be together in this place. Each day at noon, we gathered under the shady portico at Tessa's mother's home, Dr. Kathy Cordova, sitting at the center here, which is adjacent to Las Pistoleras, to eat a communal meal prepared by members of the Las Pistoleras collective, who shared the histories and cultural significance of the food that they prepared for us and offered a blessing before the meal. Through all these acts of embodied memory, a collective process of interviewing the landscape unfolded, revealing how our small effort, the digitization of Enriqueta's archive, might fit into the whole as just one more articulation of memory and place. As students developed their sense of place through these activities, they were also introduced to the skills of a more practical nature that would help them in their task for the second week, which was to scan and catalog a number of materials from Enriqueta's collection. They learned about visual narrative and digital media from Dr. Jaylin de Maria, Dr. Margie Montañez, curator of Latino and Latin American collections at UNM, led a workshop on archives and archival theory, and I introduced them to the Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective, explaining our workflows, processes, and philosophy. Enriqueta Vázquez visited Las Pistoleras twice, once at the beginning of the first week before students had begun the scanning process, and again on the last day of the field school. During her first visit, Enriqueta read from her recently published collection, Cuentos y Poetry, and answered students' questions about her life. An empty chair beside her was occupied by a succession of students who instinctively sensed that respect, required them to not shout their queries from across the room. As each student tentatively approached the empty chair, a new scene of memory exchange unfolded, mini oral histories that reminded us of how knowledge of the past is shaped in and through intergenerational dialogue. On the final day of the field school, students revived this impromptu practice, but this time, as they occupied the honored seat adjacent to Enriqueta, they shared their most intriguing archival finds and asked questions about documents that they wanted to know more about. These conversations, which bookended the students' digitization of Enriqueta's archive, did more than simply help them to better understand her documents as performances of intergenerational memory exchange, where respect, relatedness, and deep listening are critical. They highlighted the stakes of our work as memory keepers. The field school also illuminated the precarious conditions of Chicana memory, even in the digital age. As is frequently the case in rural areas, our internet service at Las Pistoleras was excruciatingly slow and was even cut off entirely when our students all logged in for the first time. Tessa and Linda had to troubleshoot midstream to switch to a business plan that was much more expensive, but not much of an improvement, all of which threw a serious wrench into our data management strategy and workflows.
1 minute, please.
Okay, this digital precarity brought home the systemic disinvestment in the information infrastructures that communities in rural areas need and deserve, a telling reminder of our privileged position as digital humanists in Research One institutions. Moreover, our collaboration with Las Pistoleras also challenged any lingering tendencies toward digital utopianism, particularly the assumption that digitization was an end goal sought by all of the community. When we invited members of Las Pistoleras collective from the Taos Pueblo to bring photos and documents to scan at our community digitization workshop on Sunday, they politely declined, pointing out that not all communities who have been left out of the historical record wish to be digitally preserved. Expanding the scene of our archival encuentro from the intimate space of the home to the public space of the community, interviewing the landscape, as Dr. de Maria puts it, reminded us that memory keeping takes many forms, from stories shared across the kitchen table to everyday acts of remembrance to the digitization of archives. And while memory can be captured with digital tools, it is activated in and through our relationship to one another and to the land, a space of encuentro that exceeds the traditional boundaries of the archive. For the archive is something more than just a collection of documents or digital artifacts. The archive is us. I'm done.
Thank you, Maria. So now I'm
Okay.
going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. Roberts. So if you want to go ahead and pull up your slides.
So I want to thank all of the planners who made this event possible and who had the amazing foresight to think about how an African-American scholar, assistant professor might engage a Latinx associate professor at this time in history. And I want to thank them for their wisdom in the juxtaposition of us having the opportunity to engage in our work together. What I intend to do during my talk is to focus in on first a general introduction to the types of places where I conduct the work, freedom colonies, and the nature of the intervention, the research intervention, and activist intervention in these places, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, and then talk intensively about a number of ways in which Texas Freedom Colonies digital curation as a form of memory work has been discussed earlier, and of place keeping is something that is not only preserved as an action or a practice within community, but something that's part of pedagogy, of critical planning pedagogy. So I want to begin by sort of introducing the guiding principles of the work that I do, that being both the research and the teaching. And they fall across a few different categories. One is that context matters. And I have work here that I'm citing from April Jackson and others, in which she talks about what community planning processes should be in Black communities. They need to attend to communities' own visions and strategies for meeting needs and desires. We need to recognize that there's not a one-size-fits-all spatial imaginary or an engagement process. And of course, being sensitive to where people already organize, what types of knowledge and communication is already privileged in these spaces, and what's the appropriate timeline and circumstances for engagement. The other is a critical framework, in part rooted in critical race theory, which foregrounds storytelling and narratives as modes of analysis and valid forms of data, and which pays special attention to historical legacies and contemporary influences and forms of racism. That the type of research is engaged research, which its higher ed purpose is knowledge creation and cultivation of democratic values. But of course, it's focused on the causes of conflict and the power asymmetry that occurs by nature of academic intervention in communities. And of course, Black digital humanities. And I'll simply reference some of the work of people I admire, Kim Gallen, all of the authors of Black Digital Atlantic, Colored Convention, and of course, Black geography scholars. So a little about freedom colonies. These particular historic African-American settlements, I call them historic African-American settlements, not to say they only existed in the past, but they are places with a historically significant story. Founded roughly between 1865 and 1930 in what we call bottom land, that is coastal land, often near former plantations and railroads. And they're evidence of intentionality and agency among African Americans, usually anchored by churches, schools, and cemeteries. And there's some 557 plus freedom colonies, freedmen's towns, settlements in Texas alone. If there were so many, what happened to them? Well, the Great Migration, violence, population loss, infrastructure projects, zoning. In other words, the nature of where these places were founded and systemic racism acted together to make the physical evidence of these places so vulnerable and precarious that often all we have left is invisibility and tangible heritage. And the three dimensions of these threats are vulnerability, access, and visibility. Vulnerability due to their locations. This map is showing you the highest concentrations of both freedom colonies and counties impacted by natural disasters. Access, often access to clean water and their proximity to hazards and disaster. And of course, visibility, that is their disappearing visibility in major cities such as Austin. So what's the intervention? The Texas Freedom Colonies Project has been an educational and social justice initiative, but more importantly, it's really what I called my doctoral research, and it is a description of the relationship between myself and those from Freedom Colony communities who I'm engaging. That is, I wanted them to understand that the work is a project. It's not simply me extracting information temporarily for a publishing purpose. So what we do is we connect and collect place-making and place-keeping stories and histories. We counter map, that is, we make visible that's what's not on the map, and secure data from varied sources, and we co-create engaged applied research with descendant communities. And so this started, I always want to reference that this started in a community called Shankleville in East Texas. And it was where I saw evidence of story being deployed in a way that really connected action to practice, action to change, or rather theory to action and change. And so Shankleville's use of storytelling, was it an anomaly or evidence of a trend is my question, right? And so what I found is that the relationship between foundational stories, that is the stories of the founding, fostered place attachment, encouraged participation, and catalyzed real planning outcomes. And all of this was not conducted, or acquired just by oral histories. It was performance ethnography, in which I engaged in a lot of the rituals and cultural traditions in these communities, one-on-one interviews, public and private archive sharing, walking tours, and co-planning of an event in which people shared their testimonies, that is their stories, their memories, and their active use of memory and story to preserve their communities. And the result, one of the results, happened to be this map. The first map, one reflecting what we think is there, and then the other map with many more data points that are red, blue, and yellow that are actually showing you, after walking tours and interviews and geotagging all of the materials acquired, what the two-county area of Jasper and Newton County actually looks like. What is the African-American footprint in these areas when we look at African-American placekeeping? And so this led to, much later, my doctor, as I said before, my doctoral research was really about what is the utility and the application of oral history and oral traditions of all forms to preserving place and sustaining attachment and commitment to place preservation. But I thought, if I could do some of what I did in this two-county area across the state, how would I do that? And that led to me working with a master's student to develop a database composed of publicly available data, privately accessed data, through a survey in which people were sharing their memories and stories, and actually the preservation and planning practices they were engaged in. And this led to the building of the Atlas in 2018. We developed our first version of the Atlas, with it really being active in 2019. Some of the other things that we do, web portal, we just completed a web portal strategic plan. We do capacity building and museum collaboration. What you're seeing here are some of our partnerships, our funders, and some of our projects. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is the ways that we leverage new media through our YouTube channel, especially during COVID, to actually engage and connect with descendants, to get their direct voices out in the public, to create active new archives of especially during COVID, where we wanted to create a space for Freedom Colony descendants to speak to their unique experiences of Juneteenth during COVID, reunion during COVID. And so our coffee talk show and some of the webinars we've developed have met that. But of course, I'm focused a lot today on the teaching. And so I've used the Atlas, and I've used the digital and teaching in a number of ways, and I'll give you a few examples really quickly. Landscapes of Demolition was a course taught at University of Texas in 2017. And it was in sort of an open course in the College of Architecture, where I taught students to conduct archival and ethnographic research, both digital and analog, by the way, and to apply critical theories to identification of cultural landscapes and to develop interdisciplinary approaches to documenting community value. And community values in quotes, because that's not an arbitrary name. That is actually included in a description of the different criteria by which the city of Austin determines that a community, that a site or a property should be awarded landmark status. And one of those categories is community value. So I wanted them to play with that in the face of the intense demolitions, gentrification that were going on, and to apply and challenge preservation regulatory frameworks. And of course, to identify historic districts and to identify what are the signifiers in the landscape of these cultural landscapes of demolition. So we had a lot of workshops, both public, private. They looked at Sanborn maps, actual physical Sanborn maps. They heard from practitioners. They heard from our librarian at the University of Texas at Austin. And they came up with amazing projects. One was a proposed district. Another was looking at landscapes of integration. That is, what part did Anglos, in this case, Jewish Americans, have in integration pre-modern civil rights movement in Austin? And there was a Esri story map made for that, and the signifiers of demolition in African-American neighborhoods. Later, once I joined Texas A&M, we used the database, that is the Texas Freedom Colony's spatial layer, to explore various challenges to their survival, including transportation projects, and how could we proactively think about cultural assets that may be negatively impacted by transportation planning in a proactive way. And this map is showing you Highway 71 to Austin and the various cultural assets along the way. And of course, these are just examples of some other courses, but I want to give a special attention to one of our last assignments. But these are examples of courses in which we leverage the digital in terms of creativity, creative posters. In the middle, we had community members come in and actually critique our atlas and say, this is realistic, this doesn't work, this is where you need to improve, and then develop an actual online guide to help people with identifying Freedom Colony landscapes. But the particular project I want to talk about today, or the assignment, is countermapping planning histories, which was in a course taught in spring 2020 in the midst of COVID, what we call a stacked course, which included master's and PhD students, some nearly 60 students, all online. And I asked them to use this website, which, yes, it does look like it was created in 1995, but Texas GenWeb is chock full of information, genealogical information that gives some insight into the history by county in Texas, totally crowdsourced. Now, even though it looks like it was built in 1995, a lot of rich data. And this data includes everything from cemeteries, churches, images. And so what their assignment was, we provided a template for them, myself and members of my research team, a workbook to fill in cemeteries, churches, schools, images, and to compose a group summary of the research process so they could highlight findings, challenges, revelations. These are just examples of some of the assigned data that we made available, and Texas A&M Library made available, which is fantastic, a finding aid for the class, which included access to these sources you see here. So what did we learn? Well, they articulated lots of challenges, and I'll just highlight a few. How do you preserve history if you can't find it? It reminded the group of Dr. Roberts' article on exclusionary historical preservation. I highlight that because very often we think our readings are enough, but it's always edifying as an educator to have students articulate that the applied assignment helped them realize the value of the literature. Sadly,
one minute, please.
Okay. Sadly, while the act of storytelling can be a rich way to transfer knowledge, it lives outside the current structure of historic records. It can be difficult to preserve. And what did they learn? This was a challenging yet rewarding project. This process has overall been enjoyable. Seeing firsthand how the Freedom Colonies have been excluded from history assisted us in realizing the importance and the urgency of preserving such cultural heritage. And finally, yes, they found new Freedom Colonies. Yes, they identified new churches and cemeteries and images. And one of the things that I'd like everyone to do during our discussion and through the rest of this conference is to use the hashtag TXFCP. And as you were listening or watching, if you thought of sources, if you are at a library, can think of any oral histories, finding aids that we should be looking at and incorporating into future assignments, we invite you to share them. And I just wanted to end with a glimpse of my team, my students. Thank you. Please follow us and check out our website.
Thank you both. That was amazing. We're going to move now into a conversation between Andrea and Maria, and just to get the conversation starting, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We met with our speakers earlier, Lorena and I did, and thought it might be fun to kind of bring the conversations together. So our hope is that you can both sort of reflect on these questions, but also speak to each other. So our first question is reflecting on your experiences, and you spoke a little bit about this in your presentations, but maybe sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of it. How has the digital, in particular, facilitated your work, and how is it challenging, especially with regard to telling the stories of underrepresented communities? Can you talk a little bit more specifically about that?
I mean, I think for us, the digital has enabled us to share archives and oral histories with a much broader community. So expanding, right, the experience of our scenes of encuentro in women's homes as we scan and listen to their stories, sharing that with a much broader community of scholars and community members, I think is the primary way, but also just giving us the ability to amass an archival collection of the size that we have. I mean, that would not have been possible before the age of, affordable and fast digitization, scanners that are under $200, even, we don't do recordings on our iPhones, but we could, right? And so I think that the digital turn has really kind of presented an array of tools that are both in terms of digital production and visualization, like the tools that Dr. Roberts is using, which I think are super important, and resource sharing that simply was not possible, 30 years ago, right? So we see the digital as giving us an array of tools that really transform the communities that we can develop across the board and beyond actually the academy.
For us, it's been about really foregrounding the existence of an African American diaspora rooted in freedom colonies, a freedom colony diaspora. And the digital has afforded us the infrastructure to capture the nature of that diaspora as it really is. So while the common story is that African Americans in Texas went straight from Galveston straight to Houston after emancipation, or they stayed and sharecropped, what we have found is through collection of stories virtually, not only virtually, but as one of our tools, we're able to capture information from people as far away as Australia, who have the roots in a Texas Freedom Colony, or from California, or from major cities in Texas. So that the idea that the African American story or the Freedom Colony story is rural and over is problematized by having access to, or making this platform of the story map of the Google 123 surveys, of making that platform available can help us better define not only the existence of these communities in terms of a point on the map, but the existence of stakeholders who have an interest in the future of the communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then did you all find, were there resistances in the digital that you found, like areas where the digital, so it sounds like they facilitated underrepresented communities, the presentation of such, but did you find ways in which you kind of backed up against the wall of the digital and it was less than amazing or restrictive or reductive or?
Well, I mean, I shared the story of how we as part of the field school, we did a community workshop on digitization, and there were a lot of different ways or reasons why people came to the workshop and were interested in that. But that presented two challenges almost immediately. One was bandwidth, right? So we literally could not, it wasn't even really possible to scan a bunch of stuff and upload it to Google Drive so that it was in two places at once and not just on thumb drives, right? But the other issue, which was not entirely surprising, but I really hadn't thought of it before, but members of the collective who are from the Pueblo community, we invited all members of the collective to come and digitize their documents. And as I noted in my remarks, some people were like, well, we have a long history of over documentation. We don't necessarily want to be documented. And in those ways, and it just sort of brought to the fore for me, like all of the assumptions, that we had carried with us into the project, that that somehow the digital would, in the preservation of memory, right, would be the answer for everyone. And it just reminded me of, the ways in which Native scholars have written about storytelling and the preservation of memory, and that there are other ways in embodied memory and in storytelling and intergenerational memory exchange that are forms of preservation that we do not think of typically, because, and from our perspective, especially as Western academics in particular, we see preservation as permanence, or permanence as a kind of object, permanence allied to or in an object, either an archive or a digital artifact, right? We don't understand a different conceptualization of permanence and its connection to storytelling.
Yeah, I think similarly, this is recovery work, right? And so if you are someone who is based in the social science like myself, that very much privileges what is the answer? What is the outcome? What do we know for sure? And if you're saying, this is a continual recovery project, is often the answer to that. However, and then what is the absolute truth? Well, this is a recovery project. Now, while we have targets and we have numbers and we have metrics, of course, that's some of the resistance is from communities. Well, when are we done? When do we have the answer? Okay, yes, we have 70% of our list verified. We'd like 80% by January. We'd like 90% by next June. So, we have those, we've learned that we must have those kind of answers, and people are entitled to those answers. And the other resistance is just a resistance to, some people believe history is real once I can touch it and it's in a book. Mm-hmm. And so in addition to saying, oh my goodness, our broadband is horrible out here in Bastrop County, for example, it's, well, an atlas is usually what I'm used to taking on a road trip. So you need to produce a regular atlas, Dr. Roberts. And of course, I'm like, oh, paper, why? It's going to change. And then it made me think, okay, that's why one of our targets is a biennial report of the state of freedom colonies now. So you have to listen. I mean, it's very simple, not just listen for the data you want, but listen for if you're co-creating something, and if you're really also co-creating an agenda in the digital, what is it that the community is really interested in? And you have to be open to hearing it and govern yourselves accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, I mean, we, when I was still at the University of Michigan, I launched a public history project called El Museo del Norte, which was a museum project. And, we had no resources, no support. We had stories, plenty of them, and we had artifacts, right? And so we did we got a small grant to do a year-long discussion about what we wanted as outcomes. And, the community did want a museum. So when we proposed, a museum without walls, which would be kind of partnering with community organizations, libraries, and museums to do pop-up exhibits, this was not something that folks saw as an end goal or that even desirable, right? They wanted their museum. Damn it, there's an African-American museum in Detroit. We want a Latinx museum. And it was, at that time, actually, the museum in Detroit, the African-American museum in Detroit, was struggling. It was in financial peril, And so, it was really difficult to honor community desires for placemaking and for permanence, right? While also acknowledging the limitations that we had in terms of economic power, political power, and just bandwidth. We didn't have objects to put in a museum, right? So this was, I think that is it's a rich place to talk about the challenges of working in and with community on these kinds of projects.
Absolutely. Yeah. And working, by yourself as a scholar, at startup, where, my startup was $600 and a handheld $50 recorder from Radio Shack. I'm dating myself now. There's no Radio Shack. And my cell phone. That was it. Right. And so then you incorporate students in a university setting, and then you got a whole other layer of complication and expense, et cetera. But what you're saying about listening and being open, and especially just even context, not just the classroom, but, we've been doing work with African-American, the Brazos Valley African-American Museum, where we've done our digital posters of African-American settlements in those districts and those projects in the museum. And they struggle, here in Bryan, here we have this giant library, but we got parts of Bryan with no serious access to broadband. Mm-hmm. And this is through these processes, rather than saying, oh, that means you should stop doing the digital. We should say, we demand broadband equity, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's still also a place to push the envelope, not against your community, but more in terms of what is the systemic, structural racism at play here that also makes the work difficult in specific ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So since both of you are talking about the importance of this space and place, could you elaborate more on how your research has made you question what it means to work in a specific cultural place or space? And, the broadband equity is one of those ways, but could you elaborate on how you think of place in deeper ways?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go first, Andrea?
Sure. I was actually, what I presented to you all today is kind of a work in progress, as you can see. And part of it is rethinking this idea of place attachment, because that's where I started with my work, is this, environmental psychology based idea of place attachment, which in some ways is, when I was starting this project, when I would read that literature, it had some dimension of pathology ring to it, right? It had a little kind of infantilization, a little bit of, place attachment. And so I think about that very seriously. I think where I started is just taking it as a definition of, length of tenure and commitment to place is place attachment. The way I think about place now is not only just deeply, but I think about what place attachment means in an age of climate change, when we have climate gentrification and we have certain ideas about places where certain people no longer have the right to be attached, right? So in doing this work, I very much looked at, or was working in proximity to people working on disaster recovery, and looking at, people who needed new homes built or repaired, and which individuals were told, hey, you need to just move and you should be happy that you have somewhere else to move. whereas people were saying, no, I'm staying in place. I have the right to age in place. And so as I've, begun this project back in 2014-ish, it is eventually my concept of place, the ripple effect of that across various spheres of planning, of politics, of climate has just expanded and grown in so many different ways, which is why I really kind of think of this as a transdisciplinary project. Is, how do we look at freedom colonies as just one of many, portals through which to examine the big questions that are facing our world.
Yeah, that is really brilliant. And I guess I think I should preface my comments about this with the fact that I had not previously examined my understandings of place and space vis-a-vis this project until we collaborated with Tessa Cordova and Las Pistoleras in northern New Mexico. Mm-hmm. I had engaged like the idea of the archive as a space of encounter, but I hadn't really thought that actually that space was the domestic space. So much of our work unfolds in women's homes, and that kind of individualized space of memory is very specific in particular, so that when we collaborated with Tessa, who's engaged in memory keeping, and not in the digital realm, but in northern New Mexico as part of a multi-generational process, right? So people in northern New Mexico have been memory keeping for hundreds of years. Right. And so we walked into this incredibly complicated space with white people, indigenous people, Hispanos and Mexican Americans, like engaging space that had been, through conflict and collaboration for 500 years, right? That was really rich. And so it really made me consider or think about our practice moving forward, thinking about space beyond the domestic space or the intimacies of encuentro, how I had imagined it, like where we're literally cooking and having coffee and eating and talking and, with this transgenerational group inside the space of a woman's home, to like stepping into this other kind of space where people were far beyond in the storytelling practices that Dr. Roberts is talking about. Like people were much more sophisticated in their analysis of space and place than I was as a kid growing up in Austin, and then later, moving to other urban spaces, had a much deeper history and understanding, and had been archiving in various ways, either through oral traditions or through writing and art, that space for centuries. Yes. And so like that kind of made me think like, well, what can the digital, like the excuse of the digital, like this is where I always say like digital humanities to me is just an excuse for memory keeping. It's not the end product, right? I mean, it's a rationale for saying, let's make, this website together, let's do this together and we can share it and this and that. So it really made me think that in my teaching, I think it made me think about maybe going in the direction, not as sophisticated as Dr. Roberts is talking about, with all of this other stuff, but I think, placemaking and digital creation in our partnerships, I think is going to take a much more prominent role. And this, I have to say that Tessa Cordova, who was our partner in this, and who comes from a long lineage of placemakers and history keepers and memory keepers, really taught us what it takes to sit in a space and begin to understand it, not understand it completely, but begin to understand it, and then begin to understand the stories and the archives and the context of that space. And so I think for our project, I really want to try doing this in other places, but it has to be embedded with organizations, communities, and people who know the space in that way, right? We can bring the digital tools, right? We can bring the capacity building in a very small, in a narrow part of it, right, of the project. But I'm more interested in thinking about how we frame our digital archiving and our processes inside of a deeper experience and understanding of space, and a more expanded one.
Yeah, it's made my work really temporally challenging, because at the same time that I'm at an event and trying to capture the right now, that's an ethnographic process, right? It's not necessarily saying this is historically what the past is or what the memory, but it is a performance of memory, right? And so the temporality of the project has been challenging, but it's also been an opportunity in the digital in that we can have one place and I invite all stories. So it's not just we have the story, so we're done with the place. It's guess what? There's, as you said, different levels of sophistication, archiving that already exists, historical societies, and here are the multiple stories of that place. And so the digital, I think if we are doing it in a progressive way, accommodates all of that, not just accommodates it, but allows it all to coexist. Right?
Well, thank you both. We are close to running out of time, but we want to make sure that we also get to some of the questions that the community has asked. We have 3 really good questions in the Q&A section. And for the sake of time, I think we want to start with the second one. Is that what we decided, Lorena? And then hopefully people can continue this conversation in Humanities Commons afterwards as well.
We're only going to have time for one question because the AGM needs to start. So yeah, let's do this one quickly. Oh,
you want to go ahead with the second one?
Sure. Where is it? Can you talk a little bit about the community members who decline the invitation to participate?
I'll just say very quickly that the members of the collective from Taos Pueblo and its surrounding areas, from that indigenous community, referenced a long history of overrepresentation and documentation. So white people have been in northern New Mexico and in these indigenous communities recording their lives and invading their space since Frank Cushing, right? Since the turn of the century, if not before, and of course before in the conquest and colonization of the Southwest. But the idea, I felt that where that was coming from was that indigenous people have been overrepresented by ethnographers and photographers. And, so they have, for very good reason, a complex relationship to representation, particularly documentary representation. I will say that what it reminded us of in terms of the digital is that while many people may want to digitize their stories and their photos or documents, they may not want to share it with the world. So they may want to keep it in sort of in the ambit of their communities, right? So they may want it to share with their communities, but not necessarily share it with the world. And so that's where I think like a bit more nuance in how we understand digitization and its purposes, right? Which tends towards saying, well, we need to share this story with the world so that we can gain visibility and people will understand that we are important as well. That may not be shared by everyone. It's something that animates us in many ways and our project because Chicanas are not in the archive. But on the other hand, there are complex relationships to archival or different complexities to the relationships to archives for different communities of color. And that's what it really brought home to us, and particularly with respect to indigenous communities whose burial grounds have been raided. And, it's just, it's a touchy situation. But the last thing I'll say about this is it really made us think that in our community digitization efforts, we do need to figure out like the extent, the limitations to, sharing and how communities wish to share. And they may not wish to share with outsiders. And so this is something that we're thinking a lot about and that others have thought about, like, for example, the developers of Murkutu and other sort of specific digital archiving tools.
I thought that was really, was that specifically for Maria, that question, I assumed?
It was for both of you.
Okay. I would just say that there's various, kind of positionalities and attitudes about giving a PWI information. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge push to work more with HBCUs. But overall, whatever the public institution or archive, HBCU or not, this idea that you were talking about, Maria, is figuring out why people want to do it and what are the options they're given. That is at the forefront of the work that we're doing as Texas Freedom Colonies Project is, let's educate people about all the options and how are they prepared and have a plan for what happens to their stories and their cultural materials and resources when they're gone. And what are all the options? So that's sort of the next phase of our work, is not just give me the information, but how can we empower you to have all of the educated choices for what can happen to your materials when you're gone.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I think the time just flew because these were amazing, beautiful presentations. I hope everybody learned a lot from both Dr. Roberts and Dr. Cotera. I encourage you to check out their projects and their work. And I also encourage you to join us for the general meeting that's happening next. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.